discussing preferences, human preferences from two different angles. Very, very interesting presentations. One is Peter Caradonna. He's a microeconomist at Caltech, and he looks at human preferences from a statistical perspective. Basically, what he's trying to do is build a model, a statistical model that allows for two things. One is the dissection of the rational part of preference choice and some residual part that is, let's call it irrational. And from a very different angle, the same type of problem set comes from Sara Aronowitz. She's a philosophy professor at the University of Toronto. She looks at human preferences and preference pairs, and she asks very similar questions, like, why should we look at preference choice as a static external viewpoint, from a static external viewpoint, and then characterize them as either rational or not rational? Why don't we try to understand the process of choice and add to this process the concept of memory and the role of memory? And once we do that, we can actually explain things like intransitivity, for example, which is one of the main sort of sources of lack of rational choice, which is when people, choose A over B, B over C, but then C over A. What she's trying to explain here is that the process of learning and knowledge creation is contingent on the way memory is structured, and that in itself has a big implication on when certain preferences are chosen and others aren't. So what she's doing here is she's kind of having an implicit structure of knowledge creation where she connects memory and preferences. And I think, to me, that's really important for several reasons. I personally, I'm very interested in the preference choice question for various reasons. I think most importantly, it's in reinforcement learning. We have to deal with the concept of reward design, and reward design actually is very, very closely tied to preference design, because if you give something a reward, you kind of have to understand what the preference is and whether that reward is being positive or negative. So in that sense, I think preference design, reward design, they're all very related concepts. And what I find very interesting in this work, both by Peter and Sara, is that they come to very similar conclusions, actually, because Peter's paper dissects, finds mathematical representations of preference design that have a logical part and an illogical part. And Sara looks at it very similarly, and she says that there is a structured, logical, deterministic part, but then there is one that isn't deterministic. Now, that's not because people are stupid or irrational or they're bounded information, none of that stuff. It just has to do with the temporal difference of memory creation. She looks at memory as a tool for further learning. So that's where she sees memory. And that changes with time. And the environment that we observe, upon which we act, also changes our representation, meaning the environment we observe is encoded in the representation of the environment, right? But that changes over time. Certain things we might value more than others, depending on the stuff that we've done just before. And therefore, there is sort of an intrinsic nonlinear process here, which has nothing to do with irrationality. It actually is just, it's a path. And the path is not linear. And that's all there is to this. And this brings me to the next thing I'll discuss, which is offline reinforcement learning and the concept of offline reinforcement learning. I've discussed this in one of the recent papers, teaching LLMs with reinforcement learning. The concept is that in offline reinforcement learning, we notice that very, very basic, very little preference pair data sets, small light data sets, can have very similar results. Training an agent with light data sets can have very similar results, like training agents with very, painstakingly designed reinforcement and human feedback. So there's very little information from detailed human feedback. And that goes back to Sara's concept. Well, because maybe the diversity of preferences is not very high of the humans that were chosen to give that feedback. And the way you get diversity in preferences is to get diversity in experiences. This is not even on podcast. It's April 26, 2024. This is Caradonna. For the data fund is up 5%. The market is up 1%. For the year, we are down 20.4%. The market's up 7%. We're underperforming by 27.4%. So these are two fundamental concepts, and then I'm adding a third presentation that I've already discussed. I just want to bring it back again. So the two presentations I'm talking about, one is Peter Caradonna, who has preference design and statistical preference capturing through analytical work. He's a microeconomist at Caltech. And then Sara Aronowitz, she's a philosophy professor, and she's involved in rational choice and choice theory and preference theory. And then I want to add the conversation of how reinforcement learning with human feedback can have little information sometimes, and the reason and the actual maybe structural reason why that's the case. And maybe as a conclusion, I want to bring the concept of learning and creativity, because I think it's kind of tangible here. And let me start with this. This is David Deutsch, actually. So we have the unpredictability of learning, which, in my opinion, is related to the unpredictability of preferences. Preferences are not always logic. We don't have actual rational choice. We've noticed that decades ago in economics, okay? Decision-making under uncertainty, rational choice. There is rational and irrational choice of pairs of preferences. And I think this has to do with Sara's approach that says, look, there is, the way we learn depends on the kind of memory we have, the representation of our environment. We act as agents, so reinforcement learning 101. We have an action based on the state. But that state depends on the way we represent the state, in other words, on the memory. And the memory is structured in a way that it helps us make decisions in the future. That's why we have memory, so we can make decisions in the future. And dependent on our experience, we start making decisions and shaping the representation of our environment. And that memory itself is a learnable process. So that's not a static thing. We're not just we're not authentic museum curators that take what we see and put it on the walls. We are actually shaping it ourselves. And the way we shape that ourselves, it could be random, it could be driven by some higher purpose of survival. That is in a whole different conversation. But the fundamental point here, and in Sara's PhD, she actually talks about this. She mentions the curator, and she talks about the curator, and she says, look, there's two ways, the constructivist and the preservationist. The constructivist is the curator that doesn't care about the environment, just creates her own reality in the museum, puts Picasso in the corner with whatever, doesn't matter. And then there's the preservationist that just wants to be authentic, just wants to see whatever she sees, and that's it, and doesn't ask any more questions, doesn't bring in anything of herself, none of that stuff. Now, the reality is somewhere in between. But if we accept that as a concept, I think we can then make the next step and say, well, there's a certain nonlinearity in the process of knowledge creation. And the process of nonlinearity is driven by this the representation of the environment. And that representation of the environment will influence the way we learn. So the next piece of information will drive our action based on the state. But the state is dependent on the way we interpret that state based on some sort of overarching, maybe meta reward that we have, that we're driven by, that we try to optimize for. And because of that, now this is the David Deutsch argument, because of that, it is unpredictable where we're going to be in the next couple of epochs, even in the next one, but definitely the next few ones. And therefore, knowledge creation and knowledge and preference creation and all of these things are unpredictable. So now let me dig a little bit deeper into Sara's concept. Okay, Sara Aronowitz, professor, University of Toronto. Her PhD, I'm talking mainly about her PhD, which is of course related to a presentation. It wasn't that long ago. And I always like to go back to the PhD of professors, because to me that's sort of their academic lineage. That's who they are. That's the stock where they come from. That's their thinking. I think you don't do a PhD unless you're convinced about the content of the PhD that you just did, and therefore it's good to sort of have a gauge of where somebody comes from academically. So in her PhD, she tries to answer the question, how come that our preferences change and they're sometimes not consistent in a temporal way? And the answer is because of memory. Now, of course, there's a lot more to that, to this than that, but to me, this is the most important thing that I want to take away. So preference design, driven by memory. Memory in itself is learnable, which means it's not a static thing. Memory adjusts to the circumstances. And because of that, the representation of the environment is contingent on some sort of optimization, which in itself is driven by probably the necessity maybe to survive or to lower the energy consumption for future learning, so we can then maybe act better in the environment. Whatever the meta reward is that we have here, we are changing our representation of the environment, and therefore that will change the way we learn, and that will impact our preference design. That's kind of what she says. She talks about learning and change. That's another interesting aspect. And I actually asked her the question. She hasn't answered me yet, so I don't know what she thinks about it. But my interpretation of learning and change is that learning is the process of incremental information gathering that in itself doesn't have a lot of impact. It's very little value on an incremental basis. But then change is when there's a nonlinear step function that makes you either better or worse off. So change is really what matters. And it's risky because you could be better or worse off. So if you're an expert in minimal art, the next minimal art exposition is not going to add a lot to your understanding. But okay, if you're an expert in impressionist paintings and you go to the Salon in Paris in 1901, in 1902, in 1903, you learn a little bit, but there's nothing really learning. I mean, you learn, but there's no change. And then you see the first Picasso paintings or the first Manet paintings, and lo and behold, there's a step function here. All of a sudden, you go from, well, it's not about impressions anymore. It's about the way you see the world, and it's a fully constructivist representation of the real world. This is what art is going to be. It's very risky. People will laugh at you. You will lose your status in the Paris Salon. You start buying some of the paintings, and then lo and behold, again, 10 years later, 20 years later, you're a millionaire and the most famous art critic in the country. or you might not be because you chose the wrong horse, kind of thing. So again, that's changed. That's, to me, that's actually consistent with AI, where we have these nonlinear activation functions, which are exactly doing that. They're trying to step from the incremental learning, the incremental weights that really don't help us too much in having the agent execute functions. And then the nonlinear activations actually can get the agent to be much more extreme in, okay, I'm going to do this and not that. And then, with the appropriate algorithms, they get much better at doing certain things. I had another idea, the Pareto optimality idea, which I didn't really bounce off, but I just want to mention it here. Again, Pareto optimality is sort of in the preference design world, means that we can be in a situation where adding preferences or choosing between preferences doesn't make the whole agent better or worse off. That's kind of similar to what I just discussed, the learning process. Like, my son goes to school, he learns biology, it doesn't really matter whether, it doesn't matter. The grades don't matter, none of that matters. He doesn't care about the knowledge there. But then there is this, and that will be Pareto suboptimal. So he's not in a Pareto optimal state. He is sort of free energy here. It's free in a sense, whatever he's learning, it's adding, it's getting him closer to the Pareto optimal frontier, but it's not really changing his state. But once he's at the Pareto optimal frontier, that's when things get interesting, because now he has to make choices. Now a preference design change or a preference change or any kind of alter of behavior actually makes a difference. And to get there, of course, you have to work hard, you have to study, and that's why we do all these things. But that's kind of a structural way or an analytical way to explain an anecdotal process, which just means that, things like luck is when you're prepared and ready and things like that. That's what it actually means. So I don't want to go further here, because again, whenever I do these philosophy seminars, I can end up discussing for hours. I think, again, what I want to take away from Sara's presentation is the concept of memory as an implicit part of the learning process, and therefore makes the learning process nonlinear, makes preference design nonlinear, and has as a perceived logical component of preference design, which actually is not logical. It's just nonlinear and dependent. It's state dependent, path dependent, and therefore it can have temporal inconsistencies. And this brings me to Peter Caradonna, who is a microeconomist at Caltech. Now, he looks at this from a very different perspective. He asks the question, look, if I have an agent with preference pairs and I want to do statistical analysis and predictions of her preferences going forward, I need to be able to dissect the logical part from the illogical part so I can have a better statistical analysis. And he does that. He does some math and vector math around it. It's kind of related to graph theory and things along those lines. Fundamentally, what he's doing, though, is very similar to Sara. He's asking the question, okay, what's logical, what's illogical, and why? And then he gets to an analytical answer, while Sara gets to a more qualitative answer. But they have very similar flavors. And I think it's very refreshing to see that, because I've, in my time as an economist, I don't think we had good answers to these questions. We just called these things sort of bounded rationality and things like that, which didn't really help. But I think this is more, I guess this is more directly applicable. This is not just descriptive. I guess that's what I like about these explanations. So lastly, I want to just finish with a paper that I recently discussed, explaining, teaching large language models with reinforcement learning human feedback. And what that paper, that particular paper, I'm going to put the link in the show notes, says is that we can have very, actually rudimentary, low light offline reinforcement learning data sets and train an agent, and we can have a very expensive, computationally and time expensive reinforcement learning with human feedback, and we get very similar results. In other words, there seems to be very little additional information in the painstaking reinforcement learning human feedback. How come? Does that mean that human human preferences or human feedback actually that there's not a lot of diversity, that we basically can get away with very little information? Or what exactly does this mean? And I think Sara and both Peter, but particularly Sara, kind of have an answer to that. They say, look, particularly Sara, she says, look, preferences are path dependent. Observations are theory laden. So in other words, when you go through the world and you build your preferences, it does depend where you go and how you go through that world. Your preferences are not static. It's not like you're born, I like this and I don't like that. Your experiences matter. And because of that, you can then infer from that when you do, let's say, reinforcement learning human feedback, you want to make sure you have very diverse humans who do that feedback. You're going to get more out of it. You're going to find more information. I mean, this is without being too political, it's definitely a case for diversity in a sort of, okay, you want to have a more intelligent system, you want to have a more intelligent society, a more intelligent anything, doesn't really matter. Diversity helps. I think this is intuitively, we know that. I think we have a political answer to this also, particularly in the US, but around the world. But of course, emphasis on what I call real diversity, which is exactly the kind of diversity where you have different paths, different experiences that lead to different preference pairs. And that leads to different types of learnings. That's the key. And that brings more diversity, more variety into a society, and it's just more interesting. So to summarize, Peter Caradonna, Sara Aronowitz, both of them come at the question of preference pair and preference pair design and preference revelation and all these questions. They come at the same problem from different sides. The problem is that some of the preference design and preference choice is rational and some is irrational. And the question is why and how do we dissect that? Peter does it analytically. Sara gives a qualitative explanation. And the concept is, in both cases, that there is an irrational part of it, which, according to Sara, has this quality of being path dependent. That's why it's not consistent temporarily. It doesn't mean that it's illogical. It doesn't mean that it's lack of knowledge. It just means that there is a part of the learning and pairwise preference mechanism in an agent that is path dependent and therefore takes different nonlinear paths and might be perceived as illogical from the outside, but actually isn't. And finally, again, if we want to have more diverse agents with more diverse preferences, we want to choose agents that have different paths, different learnings, because the learning, the memory representation which comes through learning, decides how preferences are constructed. Thank you.